It's mellow, it's raucous, it's tender, it's raw, it's the Maestro fuzz tone. You have to hear this completely different sound effect for the guitar to believe it. It opens a whole new world of music for you. Instantly, with fuzz tone, you can create guitar sounds never before heard. Yes, Maestro fuzz tone, an exciting new accessory which fits any guitar amplifier, creates unbelievable sounds never before played on the guitar. Organ-like tones, mellow woodwinds and whispering reeds, booming brass and bell-clear horns, plus many, many more. And, combined with reverberation, tremolo, and vibrato, it expands even further the range of startling effects. Now, let's listen to some of the unbelievable effects that you can create with the fuzz tone. First, let's use an electric bass. For this, a tuba sound. Wasn't that something?
I'm Will, this is Simeon and Tommy, and today we're going to talk about spectrograms and distortion. What you just heard is an early example of advertising for a distortion effect. In this presentation, we're going to talk about the history of distortion, spectrograms and how they work, and then we're going to put it all together. Early marketing for distortion offered quick solutions for artists looking for ways to make their guitar or electric bass sound like other instruments. For instance, the same advertising heard earlier mentions that the fuzz tone could help a bass guitarist capture the sound of sousaphones, tubas, and bass saxophones. For electric guitars, they promised the same for alto saxophones, cellos, and even trumpets. In the modern day, I don't think we've gone too far from these origins, as there are many options of pedals that try and do the same kinds of emulations, such as the Ravish sitar by Electro-Harmonix that tries to make your guitar sound like a sitar, or the Korg Miku pedal, which tries to make your guitar sound like Hatsune Miku. In his biography, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones stated that their song Satisfaction originally intended to have the song's main riff be played by horns. But, as we can all see, I think the advertisements for the fuzz tone worked, as he did use it in the final track. Now I would like to talk about the evolution to get to modern day distortion. In the beginning, there was overdrive. Overdrive was originally a result of pushing old tube amplifiers to their limits. While tube amplifiers are still a favorite of many tone purists, some now get similar sounds from foot pedals that try and emulate the same effect, such as the Ibanez Tube Screamer. The next stage in the evolution of distortion is the fuzz family of effects. Some of the first examples in fuzz in music occurred as the result of damaged amplifiers. In general, this damage was usually part of the speaker, whether it was the result of small holes stabbed through the speaker or cuts across it. But then came along effects pedals that tried to emulate this effect, such as the classic fuzz face used by Jimi Hendrix, or the modern Zvex Fuzz Factory. Finally, we reach distortion effects. Distortion family effects achieve their sound in very similar manners to fuzz effects, but in a more polished manner. Some examples of pedals that add this effect are the Boss DS1 and the Boss Metal Zone, if you want to have an infamous name. But how exactly do these pedals get these sounds that they offer? We'll find out later in the presentation. But for now, I would like to turn things over to Simeon to talk about spectrograms.
Let's talk a bit about spectrograms. Spectrograms essentially allow us to see sound. There's time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. Different programs and different spectrograms will use different color palettes for displaying the intensity of the sound. MATLAB here uses dark blue for lowest intensity, all the way up to yellow for the highest intensity. Spectrograms essentially allow us to understand a concept called timbre, which is the quality of sound. Why does a flute not sound like a trombone, and why do most human voices sound different from each other? Let's take a look at what different instruments look like on spectrograms to get a better understanding. This is the spectrogram of piccolo sample. Let's take a listen to it now. This spectrogram was made in Audacity, which uses slightly different colors than MATLAB, but we still use the blue for the lighter colors. Moving up in intensity, we go to purple, red, and then white. The primary pitch made is right around 1 kilohertz, and the other overtones that we have here are 2 kilohertz, about 3.25, and then 4. And you can even start to see a little vibrato here. The overtones start to increase in intensity as the sound starts to increase in intensity. You'll have to forgive me, I meant to record this in Audacity, but Audacity despises being screen recorded and will not record at a good frame rate, and it just looks awful. Now we know what a piccolo sounds like and looks like on a spectrogram. Let's take a look at another instrument. Here I have an audio clip of a violin. Let's take a listen to it. As you can see, the violin has many more overtones compared to the piccolo. The piccolo only had about 6 or 7 overtones between 0 and 8 kilohertz, where the violin vibrates at many more frequencies than that, producing many more overtones. And as the volume of the violin increases throughout the clip, many more overtones begin to appear, and even some of them even wobble with the vibrato. The violin can be described as a very bright tone in spectrogram terms due to its large number of overtones, and the piccolo can be described as a very dark sound in spectrogram terms. But what about the human voice? What does that look like on a spectrogram? What better way to show what a human voice looks like on a spectrogram than with a song? Here I have a clip from Led Zeppelin's Kashmir, about 4 minutes in, and you can even hear Robert Plant do some vowels that are pretty interesting to listen to and look at on the spectrogram. Let's take a look. As you heard throughout that clip, Robert Plant vocalized an E and an A vowel. The change between the E and the A is marked with a black line at about the 11-second mark. Notice with the E vowel, his primary intensity overtones are at 3 kHz and 2.5 kHz. And when he changes to an A, those primary overtones become the 1.5 kHz and 1 kHz. Here's another interesting example of a spectrogram from music. This is taken from King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man. Let's have a listen. 21st Century Schizoid Man. The thing I like about this audio clip is how you can see the spectrogram react to the human voice as they vocalize different things. Especially when he says the word man and shifts his voice up and down, you can see the spectrogram react accordingly. Let's move on to Tommy to see what happens when we take spectrograms and add some distortion to these instruments.
So now that Simeon and Will give you a good background on spectrograms as well as distortion, let's go and try to tie those concepts together. By looking, we're going to start off by looking at a distortion from a signal's point of view. So distortion works with a concept that in signal processing we call clipping, wherein you basically clip off the peaks of your waveform. So this is done electrically in usually a little foot pedal circuit. So in that circuit, what happens is it takes the input as just a sinusoidal wave right here. It boosts that input so that it will go about typically putting it so that the peaks are over a certain threshold. So as you can see here, we have about a doubled effect on the amplitude of these waves. After that, it puts it through what's called a clipping circuit, which generates this output over here, wherein at each of these thresholds, we're going to hard clip that. So basically think of it as taking a pair of scissors and then cutting right along that dashed line. So all the tops fall off. And what that gets us is this flat up here, okay? So the resultant of this is we go from a very nice soft sine wave over to a very harsh, close to square wave. with a small rising edge and falling edge. So once we go and take this over to the frequency domain, distortion, as I just described, distortion produces a square wave, or a relatively square wave, wherein we have a rectangle, basically a rectangle being made instead of a curve. So in this, that's what it looks like in the time domain. So now if we go about looking in the frequency domain, which is where we care about in spectrograms, we're going to find that a square wave is actually characterized by what's called a sinc function. So a sinc function is sine of pi times t over pi t, where t is your x-axis. In this case, it's actually going to be f for frequency. So what happens with this is you'll have a peak right on the frequency wherever your square wave is occurring, and then it's going to dip down and then have a diminishing effect as time or as the frequency increases, but still have the sinusoidal behavior. So what this does when we talk about the signal physically is adding distortion to a signal adds artificial overtones that diminish over time. So what this does in terms of what you hear is that it fills out the sound that an instrument being put into the system produces. So this is an example. Here's the frequency spectrum of a clean piano tone. As you can see, we have a primary at about 260-ish hertz there. This is a log scale of that, where we have the decibels of each of the frequencies on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the frequency with a log scale. So as you can see from this, we have very large primary tones where the note is actually being played at. And then we have our overtones that go off with time. Or as the frequency increases, we have our overtones. So what happens when we add distortion to this is we get a ton more overtones. This is because at each of these peaks, we're essentially going to be applying another one of those sinc functions, which is going to just add more artificial overtones for each of the overtones that already exist. Okay? So this is still going to diminish over time, or as the frequency increases. However, we're going to find that the primary signal is still there. It just has all these artificial overtones that really fill out the sound of it. So now if we go on and apply that over to a spectrogram, this is also a spectrogram for the piano. However, this we have our x-axis being time, and then our y-axis being the frequency, and then the color indicates the intensity, as Simeon had just talked about earlier. So as I said, typically these effects are done with what's called like a stomp box pedal. So at this point right here, where we swap from the yellow to the blue, imagine that the piano player went and just pressed the stomp box to apply their distortion to the piano. So they had very clean tones at very low frequencies. You can still see the overtones here with higher amplitude, as this goes from a lower amplitude sound to a higher amplitude sound, with the frequency staying the same. So as you can see, the overtones become more and more prevalent as we go and increase that. However, once we apply the distortion, it basically becomes a wall of noise, as all those overtones are adding more and more artificial overtones as a result of the distortion. So that's about it for distortion and spectrograms. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat.